Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next video on environmental science and specifically looking at ecological succession. Let's get started on this next video. So if we're going through and looking at a scenario where a volcano goes through, it erupts, and it goes through and disrupts the ecological system surrounding that volcano. So all of the land that used to be covered by green plant life and all the organisms that used to exist there no longer exist anymore. How does that ecosystem go through and start over? And can plants grow in this lava? Now, if we look at this image here, we can see if a plant is very hardy and tenacious, it can go through and successfully grow in between the cracks of that lava there and that rock. And this is really what we're going through and looking at here. This is how succession is going to start, and this is how when ecosystems maybe go through a natural disaster and collapse, this is how they grow on new land and go through and start over. So how does life go through and recover after some sort of natural disaster or ecosystem change? Well, it's going to recover via this process of ecological succession. This is the change in the number of species that live in an area over time. So important cases of succession are going to be primary and secondary succession. What we have to understand here is communities are not static. They go through and they change over time dependent upon how the environment changes. So when an ecosystem goes through and starts over, it's going to start off with the base rock, move on to lichen and mosses, small grasses and shrubs, and then eventually it will turn into a forest, a young and a mature forest over time. And when we go through and start this cycle over again, when we encounter a natural disaster, it's generally going to start back at the beginning of this succession. So what we want to be thinking about here is, how is life going to recover? Well, it's recovering via this cyclical process that over time we see different organisms go through and take over the landmass. Now, ecological succession is not going to go through and change overnight. When a natural disaster happens, we're going to go through and see from 0 to about 1 to 2 years, pioneer species are going to go through and really begin the start of that new birth of life. Now, pioneer species are going to pave the way and change the environment for other species to eventually come into that environment. And this is going to take maybe 1 to 2 years for these pioneer species to go through and infiltrate that landmass to go through and lead to, in the 3 to 4 year range, our intermediate species. So in the middle, after the pioneer species have gone through and kind of taken over, we're going to see the intermediate species go through and pick up where they left off. And those intermediate species are going to take about anywhere from 3 to maybe 5 years to go through. And what we see here are small shrubs and small grasses and bushes go through and take over that area. And then once we see after about 150 years, we're going to see our climax community over time here go through and create the young and mature forests that will go through and take over that landscape and go through and create the community that we saw before the natural disaster. Now, when we go through and look at succession here, there's going to be two types. We have primary succession, and this is going to occur in an area that has never been colonized. So if we're going through and looking at this, this is like starting off with bare rock. This is when a lava that's going to go through, come out of a volcano, hardens into rock, or a glacier goes through and retreats, leaving behind bare rock. We're also going to see secondary succession here. And secondary succession is going to occur in an area that has been colonized before. So soil is going to exist in that area. This is going to be important for us to understand. So it's almost like us going through and starting somewhere in the middle of this ecological succession timeline here. Because soil already exists, we can see larger plant species go through and grow. When we talk about natural disasters like forest fires are going to lead to secondary succession to go through and arise. Now, what's important for us to go through and note here is both primary succession and secondary succession can lead to a climax community. If we're going through and looking at the scale there, we can see that this climax community is generally this last step. But remember, we don't have to flow in this linear order. This is cyclical. It can occur in different ways. So let's go through and jump into the two different types of succession in order to better understand this and how we can achieve this climax community. So what is primary succession if we look at it in a little bit more detail? Well, primary succession occurs in an area that has never before been colonized, and generally the area is nothing but bare rock. This type of environment may come about when we see pioneer species go through and grow on that rock layer there. So pioneer species are the first species to colonize that area, and they're generally hardy organisms that can go through and survive easily in inhospitable environments. So these pioneer species pave the way for other species to come into that area. Pioneer species include things like bacteria and lichen that can live on the bare rock. So along with wind and water, these plant species and these pioneer species are going to go through and weather that rock, and as they go through and grow and die, they're going to create this soil layer. What this soil layer does is it allows our intermediate species to then come in and begin growing. And what's key for us to understand here is without that soil, our intermediate species cannot go through and grow. Now this is different than secondary succession, in which secondary succession is going to be a formerly inhabited area that was disturbed maybe by like a forest fire or something, and this disturbance already allows for soil to go through and exist there. So we can see small shrubs and grasses go through and form within that environment. So it's almost like skipping the beginning of that succession timeline there. So when we see secondary succession, we can see the start of intermediate species. And intermediate species are the second set of organisms to inhabit that area and generally are more diverse and complex. When we talk about secondary succession though, we can start off with these intermediate species because that soil exists. And with that soil, it can hold water, provide nutrients, and allow these plant species to go through and grow. Now the last step in this process is going to be the climax community. And this is the final stage in succession and results in the most mature community. However, what's important for us to note is not all ecological communities reach this stage. So if we're looking at this, the climax community, well, this is going to consist of the most diverse and most mature species within that environment. And what's important for us to understand here is this takes a lot of time for us to go through and achieve these mature species, generally 150 years plus. Now, many early ecologists thought that communities always went through this same series of linear processes during the stages of succession. And they also assumed that succession always ended with this final stage. However, today, most ecologists no longer hold these views where we end up with this climax community. We now know that most communities are disturbed too often to achieve this climax community. And again, this is this theme that we're going back to, and this concept that I want you guys to understand and really thoroughly grasp is when we go through and look at this, yes, the model shows this linear process of going from rock to mature forest, but we can start at different places in this model here, and we don't have to end up at the same place every single time. It's not static and it's not linear, it's cyclical. We can move amongst this model here to see how communities go through and arise. So if we're going through and looking at this model, it's important for us to understand this concept here. There was some sort of natural disaster that occurs with our mature forest, our climax community. Let's say it was some sort of volcanic eruption where everything's covered in rock. We can start the process over here where pioneer species will have to move in, then intermediate species, then our climax community. But if we see a natural disaster like a forest fire occur, we can start here in our model and we can see our intermediate species move in and then our climax community start. That's the difference between primary and secondary ecological succession here. It's important for us to understand this process is cyclical, not static, and it doesn't have to flow in this linear order. So to make sure we review this and understand it, there's two types of succession. Primary succession, and this occurs in an area that's never been colonized, and this is where we start off with our rock and our pioneer species and move up the ladder. But we also have secondary succession, and secondary succession occurs after a natural disaster where the soil's intact. So we can start off with our intermediate species and move on from there. Both of these can lead to a climax community, but it doesn't necessarily mean we have to end up at that climax community. These ecosystems are not static, and they can occur and arise via different scenarios and different variations. Alright, so this is going to be the end of the video. Did you learn? Did you learn a couple of things here? Did you learn about what ecological succession is? Did you learn about primary versus secondary succession and the scenarios that occur in order for those to arise? And lastly here, did you learn about ecosystems being cyclical rather than being static? They are not static, they are cyclical, and they can occur and arise in a few different ways. This is going to be the end of the video. I will see you all in class tomorrow.